It is my pleasure this evening to welcome to Beth Yeshurun, our scholar in residence for this weekend, Beck Stern Rosenblatt. So last year, as you may recall, we had Josh Culp, who was here as our scholar in February. I guess it was earlier this year. He is the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. And he was a classmate of mine when he was in rabbinical school before he decided to get his PhD in Talmud at Bar-Ilan University. And so we have an amazing connection here because Beck Stern Rosenblatt went to school with Rabbi Sarah Fort at the conservative yeshiva when Rabbi Fort was in rabbinical school. And then Bex went on to get her master's degree in Tanakh, in Bible, at the same Bar-Ilan University. So it's just interesting. We're now having her speak here for this weekend. You may remember her if you were on some of our Zoom programs during the height of COVID. She gave some talks which were very well received, and so we're delighted to bring her back here this evening. Her position is the North American Faculty in Residence for the Conservative Yeshiva at the Fuchsburg Jerusalem Center. How many people here have been to the Fuchsburg Center in Jerusalem? Yes, a few people? Okay, it's our flagship institution in Jerusalem right in the middle of the city. Great location. And she holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and German from Williams College, and as I said, is a graduate at Bar-Ilan University. She's recipient of numerous academic awards, including a Fulbright grant to Austria. And so tonight, please welcome Bex Stern Rosenblatt.
Hello, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, and after that wonderful introduction, I'm going to talk to you about crying out in the Tanakh. So sort of taking all that high energy and turning it into negative energy, if you excuse me. So we're going to tell the story of the entire Tanakh, the entire Hebrew Bible, through one word. That word is to cry out, lisok, tza'ak. Now, this word is a really interesting word because it shows up over and over and over again in the Tanakh, and it characterizes the relationship between the people Israel and God. It's our way of communicating with God. It's our way of getting God's attention. It didn't start out like that. Right now, we're in the book of Genesis in our Torah reading, in our Parshat HaShavua, right? And for the entirety of the book of Genesis, when we find that word, that to cry out, that to try and get God's attention word, we find it in the mouths of the other, in the mouths of the people who are not us, who are not Abraham and Abraham's descendants who will become Israel. First time we find that word is actually in the Cain and Abel story. I'm going to read it. I don't know where you guys are with Hebrew, so I'm going to read a bunch of Hebrew at you, and I'll translate every time. And if you all are looking at me saying, Bex, no, that's nice that you can read Hebrew, but we don't do that, I'll stop eventually, and you let me know with your vigorous head shaking or something that I can move on, okay? So first time is in the Cain and Abel story. Y'all remember the Cain and Abel story. Cain kills Abel. God turns to Cain and says, "Where's your brother?" And Cain famously says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And God replies to him and he says, "Me asita, kol demei achicha zoakim alai min ha'adama." What have you done? The voice of the blood of your brother is crying out to me from the ground. That's a bizarre use of that introduction of what it means for us to communicate with God, right? For us to reach out, to call out to God. First time it happens is with somebody's blood crying out from the ground, from the dead reaching out to God, and also what we see even more there is from a perversion of justice, from blood that has been spilled incorrectly, blood that has been first fratricide, first murder. That's what God notices. That's what gets God's attention in this lisok. All right. Second time. Story from this week's parasha of Sodom and Gomorrah, of, big bad city doing big bad things. What exactly those big bad things are, we're not so sure, but they seem to be sexual in nature. Don't go to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's okay, you can't. They got destroyed. And God notices that Sodom is doing big bad things, and God says, and forgive me, I'm going to keep referring to God as a he. That's not prescriptive. That's just generally in the Tanakh, God shows up as a he. So God says, I'm going to go down there. Ki gadla za'aktam et pnei Hashem. So because they're crying out, their voices to me have become so great that they've come before me. They've disturbed my peace, and I'm going to go down there. Okay. What God does when he goes down there, when God goes down there, is God destroys the whole city. So we've now had the first two examples of humanity trying to say, hey, God, I need your attention. Over here, please. Something wrong with my drink. And God's reply is first to be like, knew you messed up, you had to murder. First time, Cain and Abel. Second time, God goes down and destroys the city, destroys the source of the crying out. Third story in Genesis is with Isaac and Esav. All right, you'd think it would be with Jacob. You would think it would be with somebody who becomes us, but it's not, it's with Esau. And this is arguably the most heartbreaking verse in the entire Tanakh. This is the verse where you see a grown man weep. You guys familiar with this story? You know this one? No? So Jacob has just been all wily, crafty, sneaky, and stolen the blessing from Esau. You know, he dresses up like Esau, he goes in, and blind Isaac doesn't realize and gives Jacob the blessing. Esau learns what happens and goes and says, Dad, what's happened? And what we have here in the Hebrew is, Kishmo Esav et divrei aviv, v'yiz'ak za'aka gedula v'ma'ara ad meod. And when Esau heard the words of his father, telling him what had happened, he cried out, he za'ak, and not just any za'ak, but a za'aka gedula, of great crying out, and not just a great crying out, but a za'aka gedula v'ma'ara ad meod, a great and very, very bitter crying out. And what Esau says then is, God, it's horrible. I don't want to read it to you. It's so bad. What Esau says then is, Bacheni gam ani avi. Bless me also, Daddy. He's grasping at straws here. He's let out this huge, heartbreaking, bitter cry and looks to his dad and says, don't you have something left for me, Dad? And Isaac does, but it's not great. It's this like, all right, here's a little blessing of what's going to happen to your people, and none of it's very good. All right. The very last time we get this word in Genesis, it's about the Egyptians. So you remember after Isaac and Jacob, we have Jacob, and Jacob has a son. Son's name is Joseph. Joseph goes down to Egypt, and he does well for himself there. He makes good. Little homeboy all grown up. And meanwhile, the Egyptians are suffering. The Egyptians are going to have this famine. And as this famine is starting, we get this verse. V'tir'av kol eretz Mitzrayim. And all of the land of Egypt went hungry. V'yiz'ak ha'am et paro lelechem. And all of the nation cried out to Pharaoh for food, for bread. All right, so we started our story. We started Genesis. We started this beautiful story of us in relationship with God, and we have 4 times that we get the word that is our relationship, which is us asking God to pay attention to us, and it's always in the hands of the others. It's dead Abel's blood. It's Sodom, which is about to be destroyed. It's Esau, who doesn't get the blessing and whom we're sort of rejecting, who becomes his own little bad nation. And then it's the Egyptians, who are our historic enemy. Something weird going on there, right? Something odd. Why is this crying out? Why is this way of getting God's attention not something that the Israelites or the proto-Israelites are doing yet? We're going to keep going. We're going to jump into the book of Exodus, where all of a sudden we start crying out and God starts listening. If I'd asked you at the beginning, where do we see this word? There would have been like 3 of you. Not sure which ones of you yet, but there would have been 3 of you who would have been like, I know that word. I recognize that word. That is the word with which we cry out to God in the land of Egypt, and God listens, God realizes that we need God's help, and that's why the whole Exodus story happens. So the question is, why did we not cry out for all of Genesis, and then suddenly we get to the Exodus story, and crying out starts big time, and God's listening to us, and crying out becomes a particular Israelite way of connecting to God? One theory, one possibility. In Genesis, we've got nothing to lose yet. We have this twofold promise that God gave to Abraham, right? God said, hey, Abraham, listen, you seem like a nice guy. Let me make a covenant with you. I'm going to give you 2 things. 1, land. You're going to get the land of Israel. And 2, descendants. You're going to get so many descendants you won't be able to count them. You know, stars in the sky. Grains of sand. Thank you. You're going to have so many descendants. And so each of these things during Genesis is starting to happen, right? We are located in the land of Egypt, and boy, are we multiplying. Things are looking pretty good. Now, we contrast that with the 4 examples that I read to you of the people who do cry out in the book of Genesis. And each of those examples, each of those other examples, had their future threatened. Abel, dead, and his future descendants are destroyed. That's the starting with Targum Onkelos and then traditional rabbinic understanding of what's so bad about killing Abel, besides, generally don't kill your brother, bad thing. But even more so, all of Abel's future descendants are wiped out by that death. Second, Sodom destroyed. There is no after, no posterity, no future for Sodom. Esau's the blessing given to Esau is horrible. It's okay, a nation's going to come to you, but that nation is going to be a nation that serves, a nation that's always under his brother, or under the other nation that's wrestling with the other nation. And then Egypt, what we get when Egypt cries out is we get a promise of starvation, a promise of utter eventual destruction. But us, the Israelites, things are going well for us. Everything's going to plan. From Abraham at the beginning of Genesis, we've gotten the 12 tribes. We're one big nation. We've got the promise of land. And, there's been individuals who've had setbacks. During the book of Genesis, we have had a ton of tears. We've had a ton of crying as opposed to crying out. That's lifkot, to cry, like I've got a 1-year-old baby, like that kind of crying, that the sadness crying, as opposed to lis'ok, the crying out. We get Abraham crying when Sarah dies, when he's mourning Sarah. We have Jacob crying when he has his reunion with Esau. And then, if you're familiar with the Joseph story, we have Jacob basically crying the whole entire Joseph story. He's just, it's almost funny, he weeps the entire story. He's lost his son, and he's devastated about it. This changes when we get to Exodus. Our time is up. A promise is given to Abraham of 400 years of slavery when Abraham gets that covenant between the parts. And suddenly those 400 years are up. And so we start crying out, and we will not stop crying out for the entire rest of the Torah. Our ability to cry out, to say, God, we need your attention right here and right now, starts there in the book of Exodus, and it continues throughout the rest of the Torah. We're demanding justice from God. The Exodus story opens, V'yomar Hashem, Ra'o ra'iti et oni ami asher b'mitzrayim ve'et za'aktam shemati. God said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their crying out. The Egyptians hear that same crying out, but they hear it as complaint. They hear us saying, like, I can't build bricks anymore, life's really difficult. And we're crying out, it's that same za'ak that we do to the Egyptians, and they hear it as the yalinu, and we complained to them. Coolest thing, in the Exodus story, that crying out which we started will become their crying out. They will lis'ok at the death of the firstborn. Okay, so I promised you I was telling you the entire story of the Tanakh. It's a long story. We're almost done. So we become a nation that cries out for God's attention. It doesn't end after the Egyptians cry out. It doesn't end once we're in the wilderness. Over and over again, we za'ak. We cry out. We cry out to Moses. We cry out, literally, Song of the Sea, that beautiful song we sing right after we've gained our freedom and the Egyptians have been drowned in the sea. We turn around and we za'ak to Moses. And Moses turns around and za'aks to God. And this crying out turns into what the Egyptians were scared it was. It turns into grumbling. It turns into our complaint. And it doesn't end when we get the land. It doesn't end when that twofold promise is fulfilled. It doesn't end when we got the descendants, we got the land, everything should be good. We're now in the book of Joshua. We're continuing into the books of Samuel and Kings. And we keep zo'akim el Hashem. We keep crying out to God. And eventually, with all this complaining, with all this crying out, we're going to lose the kingdom. We are going to be exiled for it. That the promise we were given, that covenant we have, will be broken because we can't stop crying out. We can't stop complaining. So how are we supposed to know when it's okay to cry out? When we're supposed to say, God, I need your attention. God, this is a serious situation. This is something you need to come down and check out and do something about. Well, there's nowhere clearer. The test case for this example is in the Elisha stories. Now, you all know Elijah, right? Buddy Elijah shows up when you have a bris or when you have a Passover. It also features heavily in the Tanakh. Elijah had a disciple, a successor named Elisha, great guy. You should go read his stories. The fun thing about the Elisha stories is they're about normal people, right? Everything else in the Tanakh, it's about the kings, it's about the nation, it's about the big, big things that matter. with the Elisha stories, all of a sudden we're in the stories of normal, everyday people. And in the stories of these normal, everyday people, we have normal, everyday things happening. We have somebody who borrows an axe from his buddy, and then he's chopping some wood, and the axe head flies off, goes into the river, and is lost. And this guy's like, oh my God, and I'm using oh my God quite literally here. Oh my God, I lost the axe head, and he cries out, he's lizok. And it gets worse than that. We also have, there's a bunch of people sitting around, they're eating some stew, and the stew's bitter. The stew doesn't taste good. Stew is, maybe even a little poisonous. They're like, oh my God, there's death in the pot. They cry out, they say, somebody needs to fix this. And Elisha comes and puts a little salt in the pot, and everything's better. And it's ridiculous. It's like, y'all, this is the word you use when you need God's attention. This is the word you use when you say, God, the covenant's been broken. There's something wrong here. And instead, you're using it because your stew doesn't taste good. We've come a really long way from the nation cried out to Israel, to God in Egypt, and God heard their prayers. So, how are we supposed to know when it's a case of yucky stew and when it's a case of God, I need your attention? Best way to know is in the Elisha story, there's one woman who doesn't cry out. And that woman is in the Haftarah for this week. She's the Shunammite woman. Anybody familiar with this story? Anybody know this one already? It's the CPR story. It's the CPR story for any of our doctors. There's a woman, and she and the prophet Elisha get in this contest about who can basically give each other better gifts. Elisha is stopping by her house. She builds him this whole separate wing for him, nice bed, nice all this stuff, everything you could want. And he's like, oh my, what can I give her in return? She's built me like a in-law suite in her house. I know, I'll give her a son. Not, through me, but because I'm a prophet who can do things like that. She turns around and is like, no, I don't need that. I don't need a promise of a son. And Elisha's like, well, what else can I do for you? And she says, I am content with my lot. I am content with my own people. And what we have there, what we have in the Shunammite's words, is this acknowledgement of the Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic promise. That acknowledgement that says, I have everything I need, I have my land, and I have my people, and I don't need to cry out about anything. And then Elisha's like, too bad, I'm giving you a son, I'm a prophet, big power. And she gets a son. Couple years later, the son dies, and still the Shunammite woman doesn't za'ak. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't demand attention. Instead, she marches right up to Elisha and she says, hey, fix it. I'm staying with you until you fix this thing. And Elisha does. That's crazy. That is incredibly powerful. That's this woman who, God forbid we ever experience the death of a child. That's this woman who has lost the thing that matters most in the world. And she finds a solution, she finds a way of dealing with it, because ultimately she still has her land and she still has her community, and so she doesn't need to say, God, pay attention to me. She doesn't need to za'ak el Hashem. She doesn't need to cry out to God. She just deals with the problem with her own human agency. So, what I'm going to suggest for you all, for me, for all of us, is that there are times when we want to lizok. There's times when we want to say, somebody, God, pay attention to me. Everything is the worst. This couldn't get any worse. There's perversion of justice. It feels like there's someone's blood crying out from the ground. And sometimes that's the case, and we've got to cry out and we've got to demand God's attention because God's the only one who can fix it. But often we can be the Shunammite woman. Often we can rely on the fact that we have the things that matter. We have our community, and we have a connection to a home. And as long as we have those, we've got enough of God's attention. We don't need to be crying out. We don't need to lizok. Tov. All right, Shabbat Shalom, y'all.
Thank you for your very interesting and important talk, and we're looking forward to hearing you tomorrow. You'll be speaking at our Kiddush lunch. We'll be joining our museum minion and our chapel community. Liturgy in Action, the biblical roots of everyday prayer. And you'll also be speaking Sunday morning at 11 a.m., praying with Moses, and a study of Psalm 90.